certainly have fears that there is a serial killer at loose in Perth.
Sarah Spears, Jane Rimmer, Ciara Glennon.
And every time you saw a young girl walking by, you think, oh God, is she going to be the next victim?
Now, one man stands accused.
If police are right and Edwards is the Claremont serial killer, he's been hiding in plain sight for 20 years.
Today, court heard the moment forensic evidence linked the murders of Jane Rimmer and Ciara Glennon for the first time. Welcome to day 72 of Claremont in Conversation. Natalie Bonjolo, Tim Clark and criminal defence lawyer Damien Cripps with you. Tim, today's witness delved even deeper into these 98 critical fibres and made a connection that we really had never heard before.
Yeah, that's right, Nat. He did dig very deep. As you say, there's 98 fibres that the prosecution say are critical. We got through about 5 of them today, so you can imagine how long we've got to go. But as Ms. Barbara Gallo explained at the end of the day to the judge, I'm going as fast as I can, but I need to go through them all. So, and 2 of these fibres related to Jane and Ciara, and they were found at different times, at different points in the investigation, but were eventually brought together through the database at the ChemCentre, which we discussed yesterday, the groundbreaking database, which was basically created because of all the different macro fibres. The first fibre was a blue fibre that was found in Jane's hair through the various investigations and examinations of Jane's hair, which we've also detailed, that it was found in a bucket, having been taken from the post-mortem, split into 5 different areas, shaken, tweezed, examined under polylight, and I mean hundreds of fibres were found, but there was this one particular blue fibre that was placed on the database, and then 2 years later a similar fibre was found in Ciara's hair when similar examinations were done then. And when these 2 fibres eventually came together via the database and the scientists at the ChemCentre, it was found that they corresponded in width, in luster and in colour. And we saw a slide photograph of that comparison today, and even to the naked eye they looked identical. And so this was the moment, or one of the moments, one of the very early moments, that all the assumptions and leads that the police had followed up because of the similarities in the murders, i.e. when they happened, the place they happened, the way that the girls were dumped, and everything that we've gone through over the past 4 or 5 months. This was a physical, forensic, tangible link that had been found in a lab and then was handed to the police to say, this fibre on Ciara matches this fibre on Jane, and we think this is a link that you will need to explore in terms of if you find out where that fibre might have come from, and you might find out who killed them.
Wow. And so this is 4 years before Bradley Edwards is arrested.
Correct. So at this point in the vast topography of this case, they know that this blue fibre it seems to be a match, but they don't know where it comes from, and they haven't got a source, and so that is why, as with many of the other fibres that were found over the expanse of the investigation, they didn't really come into clarity, into crystalline clarity, and become potential key prosecution evidence until Mr. Edwards is arrested, because they've got them all lined up in their database. They know that they say there's all these groups that match, and as we heard yesterday, the grey fibres that they'd matched and found on both women as well. They had found a source from that, the car, the Holden Commodore VS series, particular series of car. But again, they didn't have the car, they had a car type. And in the case of the blue fibres, they didn't have any source until Mr. Edwards was arrested, and when they when he was arrested. Then they dug deep and dug deeper and dug deeper, and even then it took them 2 years, nearly 3 years, to make the link. And prosecution say that link is the Telstra workwear, particular type of Telstra workwear that Mr. Edwards was wearing at the time of the murders, and they managed to get a sample, an exemplar of those trousers, which they tested against this blue fibre, and they then got a swatch, an original swatch from the manufacturers, which they also tested against those blue fibres that matched on Ciara and Jane, and the prosecution say they were a match as well, and so hence the circle is complete according to Miss Barbara Gallo and her prosecution team.
So, Damien, how important could this evidence that we've heard today be that links these murders in this case?
Nat, I think it's extremely important. I think that if Judge Hall accepts this evidence in the way that it seems that it's being presented at the moment, it's key to, as you just pointed out, linking all of these crimes together. And just off the back of those thoughts, Tim, just flowing on from what you had said then, what I found quite interesting was the use of the word match. We've been hearing about these fibres being matched, and repeatedly we keep hearing about them getting matched to each other and to different source fibres and other things that seem to be keeping the momentum of these fibres propelling forward. Tim, are you in a position to give us a bit of insight into what is a match?
Yeah, absolutely, mate. So the way Mr. Powell explained it, there are various elements to the fibres, obviously, colour being the obvious one, but there is also a delustrant, which is the material that the manufacturer puts on the fibre that makes it shiny or not, and the amount of delustrant you put on a fibre determines the shine, if you want to put it that way. There's the actual diameter, or the breadth of the fibre itself, and then there's also the makeup of the fibre. It can be various shapes, trilobal, square. It might have gaps in the middle if the manufacturer wanted a lighter fibre. So it's not just a case of holding it up to the light and looking at it. It's much more detailed and complex than that. And then there are various other methods that are used by the ChemCentre, as explained in court, to gauge all those pieces of the puzzle, if you like. And what we've seen today over and over again related to different fibres is the different types of microscope work that is done and the different lights that are done on it. The two that really stand out in terms of a visual thing, it's what's called a bright view of the fibre, which is, you can see the fibre basically on a white background, and it's through that you can see the delustrant and the width and that type of thing. And then there's another camera that they use, which basically it looks like it's in negative, but in that camera it shows there's a rainbow effect on the fibre, which shows what type of fibre it is. In this case of this first fibre that I spoke of, that was polyester, and it shows up on the microscope slide as a sort of rainbow effect.
Yeah,
it's ticking all those boxes. So it's putting one fibre literally side by side with the other and seeing if the colour matches, the delustrant matches, the width matches, under all those different types of things. And if they're all the boxes are ticked on both sides, then the scientist is confident enough to say these fibres correspond. That is the word they use, and that is what we would term as a match. But then they say if one or t'other of the elements don't match, but some do, then they can say the fibre is similar. And then if there are various the variance, the colour doesn't match, the width doesn't match, then they'll say they differ, and they cannot then conclude that those fibres are matching. So it's a very detailed process with every fibre, and they go through all sorts of checks before they can say, yeah, we say that fibre came from the same source as the other one.
Description just given by Tim, that tells me that these fibres are significantly important in that they will provide a thread, if I can put it that way, pardon the pun, for each of the cases to be linked together, which is what you asked me in the first point. And one might say, if they were looking at this from above and saying, well, it's just not enough to say that there's some fibres in each of these cases that seem to match up to a fibre that could be related to the accused person. And that's why this test is so important. It's beyond a reasonable doubt, because it's not enough for the prosecution to come to the people of Western Australia and say, look, all these fibres match up. And even if they're impeccably matched across the whole set, there's variables that could create an environment where those fibres all matched up. But then when you throw in the other evidence, which we've heard about over the course of the podcast, those fibres then become significantly important, because they're the things that's the one thing that's threading everything together. And then you might say, well, that's not enough, but then you put everything else in amongst it, as we've discussed with the DNA before. They become extremely central to how you might think about whether what's being alleged actually took place.
And I think what you raised last week, Damien, about the fact that the prosecution weren't saying that these fibres directly came from Mr. Edwards or a pair of pants that Mr. Edwards had owned. I think, if I'm paraphrasing what you said last week correctly.
Yes.
Yeah, but and that is why that this car, the Holden Commodore that they miraculously found 20 years after Mr. Edwards owned it, is so important, and it sort of brings everything together, because what they say is that the fibres from that car were found on Jane and Ciara, but they also say that those blue fibres that were found on Jane and Ciara were also found in that car. And we know for a fact Mr. Edwards has admitted that he drove and had control of that car for those 2 years. And the way they found those blue fibres were they went to a really dark recess of that car, under a bracket, under a cover, which probably wouldn't have been touched or couldn't have been touched really for those 20 years, which is why they concentrated on those areas of that car. And they found those blue fibres, and of course they've done the matching with the fibres that were found in the car with the fibres that were found on the girls, and they matched as well. So without that car, that would have punched a pretty big hole in the whole picture, you would think, because you could then say, well, you know, it's improbable, but it's not impossible that both Jane and Ciara could have come into contact with someone from Telstra. I mean, but to have those particular fibres in that car that Mr. Edwards owned, that's the physical link, the direct silver line running through it all, which the prosecutor is right as we speak, or just before we speak, was holding up and saying, yes, all the cards match all the different elements, and the last one is the physical link to Mr. Edwards and the car.
In relation to the fibres from the car, given that you've been sitting through the evidence and you've heard the direction that the prosecution and the defence are taking, could you say for certain that the fibres that they're using as a reference point coming from the victims could have come from the same model of car but a different car?
Well, you're talking about the grey fibres now, Damien.
Correct.
Yeah, those. Yeah. Well, that's once again that's why the discovery of this car was such a massive bonus for the prosecution, because they had already pinpointed precisely this make of car back in 2013, and then in the report in 2014, 2 years before Mr. Edwards was arrested. They got a car, a Holden Commodore VS Series 1, tested it, or got the samples from it, compared them to the grey fibres certainly found in Jane's hair, and come up with that car. And that was in that report 2 years before. And then Fast forward 2 years, 2016, Mr. Edwards is arrested. They find his car on the same day, seize it. So not only have they got that to hang their hat on, well, look, we pointed to this make of car 2 years before you found this bloke. But then they had his car, and so they were able to get all the matches, all the swatches and cutouts from the seat from there, and compare them again, and lo and behold, what did the prosecution say? Well, they were a match as well. So once again, actually having the car and being able to point to those fibres and his car as being not just a car, not just that model of car, but that the car, again, is just a huge piece of the puzzle, which the prosecution say brings it all together.
Yep. Well, that's why it was such a massive breakthrough at the time. Tim, were there any fibres that didn't match?
Yeah, there were a few, Nat. And I'm sure we're going to hear quite a few more, because as I mentioned yesterday, when all this fibre evidence was brought together in this report in 2014, 129 groups of fibres were found amongst the myriad of evidence. But we're only hearing about two. This grey group and this blue group. Now, when we get to the defence, and we know the defence have their own fibre experts, so this is an area where the defence have significantly concentrated on. They've got their own expert who's written a report, but we are yet to hear it, obviously. But it is obviously an area that they're going to focus on. And some of the matches, or some of the comparisons that ChemCentre made, they weren't an exact match, but what we're obviously going to hear about a lot of the exact matches, the corresponding matches, because that goes to their case. Now, when we get to the defence case, who knows what they will show in their expert report, but we do know that there are thousands and thousands of other fibres that we are not going to hear about from the prosecution, and that will be, I'm guessing, where the defence might throw in some reasonable doubt, or try to.
And you mentioned earlier that you could see these comparison fibres in court today. Can you just describe that for us? I mean, to you and to the naked eye, did they look identical?
Yes, they did. I mean, Justice Hall was kind enough to release a sample of them, so there will be some around on the websites and things tomorrow if the listeners want to go and have a look. But I mean, you could basically say two fibres, one on the left, one on the right, a line down the middle of the slide, and the critical fibre on the left and the comparison fibre on the right, and they're basically lined up to show that the colour and the dilustrant and the width all appear to match. So if you were to take a line out of the middle, it would look like it was one single fibre. And we saw dozens and dozens of them today, and we're going to see hundreds and hundreds more over the coming days, where once they got one critical fibre, and then they had to compare them to all the others. And then when we talked about the hundreds of thousands of possible combinations, and that's why the ChemCentre developed this database, so they wouldn't have to do it themselves. They could hit one and then try and compare it to everything else, and the match would eventually spit out of the machine, and those are the matches that we're hearing about.
And you mentioned that, you only went really through a handful of these fibre comparisons today out of the 98 critical fibres. So I'm curious as to just how long Rhys Powell's could actually be on the stand.
So are we, and so was Justice Hall. That was the very last question of the day that Justice Hall asked, because the initial estimation was for about 4 or 5 days for Mr. Powell to be on the stand. So maybe finish Friday, possibly finish Monday. And as I said, 98 to go through and 5 down. So you can do the maths. If we go on that pace, we're going to be here until, at least next month. Justice Hall asked Ms. Barbagallo to make a guesstimate of how many fibres per day she thinks she could possibly go through, because it wasn't just a case of that's one, that's the other, and on we go. Rhys Powell had put a summary sheet together of each critical fibre, exactly what had happened to it all the way through the journey, and then all the comparisons were made, and he had to show each one. And as Damien will no doubt know, it's not a case of just throwing a book at the judge and saying, read that. The evidence has got to be given in a formal way in open court for everyone to be able to examine it. So Ms. Barbagallo was asked for a sort of a pacing estimate. She said between 8 and 10 fibres per day to get through. Which if we are 93 to go, even if we go on 10, that's 9 days, so that takes us to the end of next week. So there was a little bit of bartering done at the end of the day, and Mr. Jovic was asked whether if there are any of these fibres that are not going to be contested by him, which would mean that the judge would not have to see the photos and go through it. And Mr. Jovic said he would try his best to go through them as we're going along, and maybe pick out one or two, or maybe if we're lucky 10 or 15 that we wouldn't have to actually do formally. But that is not something Mr. Jovic should or would concede easily, just for the sake of time, because as we've said many times during the course of the trial, it's not his job to make it any less arduous or tedious. It is his job to scrutinise each and every piece of evidence as closely as he can, and if he has questions about it, it's not just his right, it's his duty to ask them, because if he can create some doubt through those questions, and that is what he's there to do.
Yeah. And we have chatted before about, just this absolute detail in the fibre evidence and whether this had been used in other trials. And I know we sort of have suspected that maybe not to this degree, but we've actually been contacted by a previous witness in this trial, Belinda Evans. And Tim, she mentioned several other of these high-profile cases that you're probably across where fibres did play a key part.
Yeah, so... and we've got to thank Belinda for getting in touch, because it's hugely insightful to hear from an actual witness, and she was kind enough to detail some of the other cases that she herself had worked on. Belinda was actually mentioned in court today as having done some of the work on these critical fibres. So, and she's mentioned some that she's done work on. One that Damien might probably be aware of as well was a double murder in Western Australia, which, if I'm correct in my memory, resulted in the single highest minimum sentence ever handed down for a murder. This was a murder of a couple by the name of Frank and Kim LaRosa. This was a particularly brutal murder, resulting in the death of both the LaRosas, and the chap who was eventually convicted of that murder got a minimum jail term of 30 plus years from memory, and Belinda said that she had done fibre work on that case. There was another murder up in the holiday town of Broome in the north of Western Australia, which she'd also done work on, and another murder case of a homeless man in Fremantle, which is south of Perth, that she'd also worked on, as well as some other armed robbery cases, including one where the accused was wearing a red Santa suit, and she was asked to actually analyse the fibres left behind at the scene. So, obviously, we know fibres are a growing forensic area of interest in criminal cases and expertise, but I think even Miss Evans might concede that maybe never in a trial in Perth would we have possibly heard so much fibre evidence from so many expert witnesses and in such detail.
Yeah, such incredible detail. Now, just some COVID news here in WA. Obviously, coronavirus is still having devastating impacts. But we heard today that one of those iconic Claremont night spots that we've been talking about has announced that it won't reopen its doors after the pandemic is over. So, Damien, you might have visited the Conti in your day.
No doubt in my mind.
I always like to know what's happening in my community. So I dare say that on the occasions that I might have wandered into that wonderful establishment, I had been in there purely on a reconnaissance mission.
Yeah, this is. I mean, this is. Well, I mean, it's obviously relevant to us, given that how much we talked about the Claremont Hotel, or what was the Continental Hotel, and yeah, the current owners, did announce today that due to COVID-19 and the restrictions currently on bars opening in Perth, that they won't be reopening after those restrictions are lifted. There's been a lot of talk in recent years about a development of that hotel, because it is an historic sort of building, and that takes a lot of work. But yeah, pretty much after the trial, or I think they're going to close in the next week or so, and so even before the trial is finished, the Continental and the Claremont, as we know it, will cease to exist. It will exist as a night spot at some stage in the future, but it certainly will not look anything like what it looks like now. So that again brings into focus the videos that myself and Kate produced just a couple of weeks ago, where we stood at the pole where Jane was last seen, and I think if the plans as they are formulated go ahead, that part of the building will be part of the building that won't be there anymore, which will be, it will be an iconic part of the Perth's western suburbs, which will disappear forever.
That's right. So if you would like to see that area and see what it looks like for yourself, that video, as Tim mentioned, is on thewest.com.au, and it's a two-part video. And Tim, you also take us to the burial sites of Ciara and Jane. So we know what's in store for tomorrow. Just a couple of quick questions, though, before we go. We've got one from Amelia. I'm interested in how the prosecution puts its case with respect to the blood, or lack thereof, found in the accused man's vehicle. Is the prosecution's contention that Ciara and Jane had their injuries inflicted at the places where their bodies were found? Otherwise, one assumes if the injuries were inflicted before or during their time in the vehicle, there would have been traces of blood.
Yeah, well, they certainly did look for that blood in that car when they found it, and did not find anything, any biological link at all to either of the girls, whether that be hair or fibres certainly from Ciara's clothes, or any blood or anything. Way back at the start of the trial, it was postulated by the prosecution that certainly in Ciara's case, because of the way she was found and the way that the blood had pooled under her body and then soaked into her t-shirt, that at the very least she was still bleeding when she was placed at that site. So that was it. So that was the argument there was that it was more likely than not that she had been injured there, and the wounds had been inflicted where she was found because of the bleeding. In Jane's case, because there were no clothes found on the body, it was much harder to make that assumption, and that is why a lot of vegetation, and in fact the inch of soil, or certainly vegetation from where Jane had lay, was collected and examined very, very closely, because they were trying to establish a forensic link, or what basically had happened at that site, and if anything had happened at that site, or where it was done. So it's a really good question from Amelia, and it's again a long answer, but the short answer is no blood was found in that car, and so the prosecution have not been able to say anything happened in that car other than what they say is the physical forensic link between the girls and the car, which they say means they must have been in it at some point.
Yeah. And Damien, a question for you from Kit, who's listening in from Brooklyn. Damien brought up a point about the Telstra fabric fibre match only narrowing down the field to Telstra workers. I wonder if there was research done to see who else working at Telstra at the time drove the same sort of car, at least that would match with the fibres, and perhaps had close contact with Mr Edwards. Could there be a case made that the transferred DNA came from another Telstra worker who worked in proximity to Mr Edwards, had some of his transferred DNA on him and committed the murder. That would explain the fibres from the car and the uniform. I certainly wouldn't believe it, but reasonable doubt is a funny thing.
Well, it's a great question, Kit, because when we're in the process of trying to prove or resist the prosecution being able to prove something, one of the things that becomes really important is what the evidence shows. Now, everybody says, well, that's an obvious statement. But I think when you're trying to get to the bottom of and answer that question, what does the evidence tell us? So what we were talking about earlier in this podcast was how when you put two sets of evidence together, the case becomes stronger. So in this case, what we're talking about here is you are potentially saying, could it be said that somebody else was the contributor of the fibres and that somebody else was the contributors of the DNA? Well, it certainly could be. But what the judge or the jury or whoever the person is has got to get to the bottom of is there any evidence before the court that says that that's something that's a reasonable proposition, or is the evidence that's before the court such that, if I could put it this way, you are cornered into a position where it's very difficult to accept that that's something that's possible? And I think that you answered your own question when you said you would find it quite difficult to believe. And I'm certainly not saying that, I see it either way. I always try to approach these things with a really neutral view. I think that for any advocate, I think that it's difficult if you go in there with a view about how something's going to play out. I think you need to let something play out completely in your sight, as in by way of the trial. Let something completely play out before you can say, as you said there, that it would be difficult to believe. But let's see where all this evidence takes us. We never know what tomorrow brings. You never know what the defence are going to do. So there's still a lot of water to pass under the bridge. But your observation and the way that you've thought that through, in my view, it's only my humble view, is really good. And these are the points that I've been trying to make with Tim and Nat and Ali along the way, is that even though they say these fibres are super important, let's just check every angle. Isn't it possible that these Telstra pants were worn by a Telstra worker from the Northern Territory who was visiting? There's all these different hypotheses you could come up with about how those materials could be where they are. But the point is the prosecution are slowly but surely whittling them down so that there's very little wriggle room for all those hypotheses to be. And there's going to come a point, I would have thought, where the prosecution have gotten absolutely to the highest they can take it. And there's probably still a little bit of wriggle room, if I could put it that way, when they get to that point. But the question is then, what does the evidence say to the person making the decision? Is there any other possible alternatives on the evidence? And I mean, it's a very difficult question to answer. And I mean, that's why juries often struggle with that concept, because that's not an easy concept for 10 or 12 people to agree on. So in some senses, this judge is in an advantageous position because he's just got that decision to make himself.
Yeah.
And I think Kit has previewed something that we're going to hear about towards the end of this fibre evidence, and that's something called adventitious matches, which is a posh scientific way of saying, could the fibres have come from anywhere else? Yeah. And we got just a tiny preview of that today on this massive spreadsheet that Mr. Powell has produced, with over 2,000 lines on it of all the different types of fibres that they've tested. And obviously we're talking about critical fibres here, but they've also tested what they call adventitious matches, which are possible other sources of these fibres. And they included, and we saw a few today, police uniforms, police forensic uniforms, state mortuary uniforms, other cars and things of that nature. So what the prosecution have done there is try to head off the defence at the pass and say, aha, we think you're going to try and say, well, couldn't the blue fibres have come from coppers? And so we've gone out, we found the uniforms from 95, 96, 97, we tested them, and then we're going to say, well, look, there's the evidence. This is the forensic uniform that they would have been wearing at the scene of Jane's body discovery, for instance. And we've got one of those uniforms, we've tested it against this blue fibre, and we are going to say, no, they don't match because X, Y, Z. So it's a really good question for that reason. It's so good, in fact, that the prosecution asked it of themselves some time ago, and will be putting forward evidence, we think, to try and cut out, or as Damien's put it, to try and lessen the room for wriggle. So when it comes to the defence, they've really got their work cut out.
Good on you, Kit. You are ahead of the game there.
Yes, and Kit wins the prize for question of the week, and it's only Tuesday.
And I think you're right, Jamie, and I really love how everyone following this podcast is challenging their own thoughts on the evidence and really thinking very deeply about it, because the questions are incredibly insightful.
And one question that all the listeners could start to ask themselves is one that I think we've been over and over time and time again, but it's one that the listeners could really start to ask themselves. If you were the defence lawyer, would you put Mr. Edwards on the stand?
If any of our listeners can answer that question, they can email Claremont Podcast at, well, you know the email better than I do now, Claremont Podcast at wanews.com.au.
Absolutely. Let us know what you think. Which way are you going with this one? Well, thank you both so very much for your time and your expertise, and thank you for your company. We'll be back tomorrow for day 73 of Claremont in Conversation. Chat then.
This podcast was produced by Kate Ryan and Alicia Preedy and recorded in the studios of 7 West Media. Audio files were provided from the archives of the 7 Network and the West Australian. Sign up for daily emails and all the latest on the Claremont trial at thewest.com.au.
For a fresh take on the news that matters, tune in to WA's newest morning show, The West Live, with Jenna Clark at thewest.com.au. The West Live not only delivers on what the day's big news stories mean for WA with hard-hitting interviews and analysis, but it will also make you smile with light-hearted chats and local gossip. The West Live, like Talkback Radio, but without the interruptions. Listen live weekdays from 8:45 a.m. on thewest.com.au or catch up with the podcast.